Morning, folks, and welcome to today's episode called Bernard Arnault, 1949 to 1997. And hand on heart, this has been one of my favourite stories to research because this is a story that it's just so good. It begins with a young engineer running a small construction company, and he has an epiphany in the back of a New York taxi. And from there, it unfolds through massive boardroom upheavals, aggressively structured deals, and a long-term vision that never really wavered. And what sets Arnault apart isn't just the financing or the tactics, it's the creativity that you rarely see in a business titan. It is a cracking story. Enjoy. So, Bernard Arnault, he was born on the 5th of March 1949 in Roubaix. This is a city in northern France, and it's called the Manchester of France because it's got a landscape of brick chimneys, sprawling wool mills, and an almost, I suppose you'd call it, feudal social structure, because this wasn't Paris, this wasn't glamour, this was an industrial, gritty, working class French city. And his father, Jean, he was an industrialist from the old school. He was a civil engineer who owned and operated this company called Ferry Savinal. It was a construction company that he'd inherited from his father-in-law. And Jean was hard, a tough man. They say he would physically shake a foreman on construction sites to make sure that the deadlines were met. But on the other side, there was his mother, who was totally different. Marie Joseph, her temperament was more artistic. She was a pianist, she was creative, and she had an obsession with the fashion house Christian Dior. And this is crucial because young Arnault, he watched his mother's reverence for Dior perfumes and couture, and it was a reverence, they said, that nearly bordered on obsession. And so in the grey industrial bleakness of Roubaix, Dior represented something else entirely: Parisian, elegant. And so young Arnault had these two crucial influences: the hard industrialist from his father, appreciation for elegance from his mother. And that duality, it really would sit at the heart of his career. The household itself was governed by strict Catholic values, and it was enforced by a very, very devout grandmother. So ostentation was frowned upon, waste was a sin. And this upbringing, it created a paradox that would define Arnault's life. A man who lives relatively simply himself, but of course creates the ultimate symbols of global extravagance. His real education would have started at the Lycée Faidherbe in Lille, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right, when he entered the Prepa. This was 2 years of pretty brutal training for France's top engineering schools. So it's heavy on maths and physics, not much room for creativity. But in 1969, at the age of 20, Arnault achieved what is the pinnacle of French academic success when he was admitted to the École Polytechnique. This is simply known as IX because of the crossed cannons on its insignia, and it's a military academy under the Ministry of Defence, and it's also the nursery of the French ruling class. It's the place that produces the technocratic elite who manages France's infrastructure and industry and politics. And the curriculum is grounded in abstract mathematics, theoretical physics, the idea being that there is always a rational solution to every problem. And Arnault, he explicitly said that this training, it gave him an analytical and synthesis capacity, those are his words, that allow him to analyse challenges in a factual and detailed way. And this is the key differentiator between Arnault and his future competitors in the luxury business, because unlike traditional luxury owners who operated on intuition, tradition and emotion, Arnault saw the complete business: design, manufacturing, marketing, distribution. And he realised that while the design had to be magical, the process, it had to be industrial. So an engineer with an artist's eye. And that's the thing about Arnault. He's also an artist, because while he's mastering differential equations at IX, he was also playing the piano at concert level proficiency. This matters. The piano was his outlet for emotions that had no place in, the engineering world. And crucially, it gave him a way to talk to artists. When he later dealt with temperamental talents like John Galliano and Alexander McQueen, Arnault could connect with the creative process in a way that most business people can't. Now, in 1971, Arnault graduated and returned to the family company, Ferré Savinal. Now, this company had built factories for other industrialists, so it was solid, respectable, but unexciting. And during this period, Arnault also cemented his status within the northern elite through his marriage, because in 1973 he married Anne de Warven, and her family were major players in the wool trade, and they had 2 children together. So for 5 years, from 1971 to 76, he worked as an engineer, learning construction, cost estimation, project management. But it was during this time he identified a fundamental weakness with the business. It was low margins, no scalability, constant exposure to labour disputes. He'd also identified that the post-war economic boom had created a new leisure class. The French were going on holidays. They wanted second homes. The real money, young Arnault believed, wasn't in contract building. It was in developing and selling real estate as lifestyle products. So in 1976, at just 27 years of age, Arnault approached his father with a pretty radical plan: sell the industrial construction division and pivot entirely to real estate development. Now, this was a huge move for a family business. Sell the very heart of the company founded by his grandfather. But according to all accounts, Jean asked the young Arnault, "Are there serious risks?" Bernard replied, "Yes." And Jean, displaying, I suppose, the gambler's instinct his son would inherit, responded, "You don't do good business without taking risks. Go for it." Now, let's just pause here for a minute, because we have to believe that at just 27 years of age, young Arnault must have been a pretty impressive figure for his father, this tough, hard-nosed businessman, to agree to this massive pivot. So in 1976, the industrial construction division of Ferré Savinal was sold for about $15 million. It was rebranded as Farinel and specialised in timeshares and holiday apartments in prime spots along the French Riviera and mountain resorts. And by 1980, Farinel was generating substantial turnover, estimated around $15 million per year. So Arnault was a wealthy, successful provincial developer. But a political storm was gathering, because in 1981, François Mitterrand was elected as the first socialist president of France. For the French business class, this was pretty traumatic, because the Programme Commune of the Mitterrand government included the nationalisation of 36 banks and major industrial groups, a significant hike in the minimum wage, and most terrifyingly for Arnault and the wealthy French was the impôt sur les grandes fortunes. And excuse my French again, but that translates as tax on large fortunes. In other words, a direct wealth tax. So you can imagine the atmosphere in the posh arrondissements of France and among the French business class was panic. There was a fear of a red dawn where private capital would be confiscated. And Arnault, whose business relied on discretionary spending of the wealthy, he decided to vote with his feet. In late 1981, he and his young family moved to the United States, where he built a large Mediterranean-style house in New Rochelle, just north of New York City. His move coincided with the dawn of the Ronald Reagan era, and while initially interest rates were high, deregulation and I suppose the prospect of a more market-friendly environment, they were beginning to unlock value. One of his main developments was a luxury condominium in Florida, and he netted a few $1 million from that. And there were a few other projects, nothing really big though, but this is the thing. What Arnault got out of his few years in the US wasn't huge earnings. It was what he learned, because this is the 1980s, the dawn of the corporate raiders, of LBOs, and Arnault soaked all of that up. And he also learned a lot from the guy who he was living right next door to, a guy called John Kluge. He's the billionaire founder of Metro Media. Now, Metro Media was this low-profile holding company that quietly sat at the centre of US media consolidation. Kluge bought clusters of local TV stations, radio stations, billboard companies, cable systems, fragmented assets that could be run more efficiently together. And then when the moment was right, he sold them selectively, often, of course, for more than they were worth as a whole. For example, the sale of Metro Media's TV stations to Rupert Murdoch would later form the backbone of Fox. Kluge was the prototype of a new kind of American capitalist, and Arnault observed him closely. He saw that in America there was no sentimental attachment to legacy. If something was worth more dead than alive, Kluge liquidated it. And that lesson was, of course, reinforced by the corporate raiders of that era, Jimmy Goldsmith, Carl Icahn and others, who showed that companies could be broken up and reshaped with value created through financing and timing. But the most important thing Arnault took away from America wasn't a tactic or a financial trick, it was an epiphany, one that came in the back of a New York City taxi. So Arnault was engaging the driver in conversation, asking him if he knew the name of the French president. And this was when Francois Mitterrand was emerging as one of Europe's most visible and powerful political figures. And the driver replied, "I don't know the name of your president, but I do know the name Christian Dior." That sentence was a moment of clarity because it revealed to Arnault that a luxury brand like Dior possessed recognition that transcended nationality, and he realised the future lay in leveraging the, symbolic capital of France, luxury, history, taste, using the financial techniques of America, leveraged buyouts, aggressive restructuring. Now, at this time, Dior wasn't a standalone company. It was owned by a huge textile conglomerate called Boussac, which had filed for bankruptcy in 1981. And between 1981 and 1983, the company was placed into judicial protection. In other words, the French state were effectively running it because they wanted to safeguard the jobs of the 20,000 people that worked in Boussac. But by 1983, France's socialist experiment was running into economic reality. Inflation was rampant. Their currency, the franc, was under attack. President Mitterrand made a famous U-turn, moving towards austerity and a more pro-business approach to stop money leaving the country. And of course also the government began looking for private investors to save the country's ailing industrial giants because the state couldn't afford to keep bailing them out. And one of the companies they wanted to offload was Boussac. So Arnault realised that if he could buy the conglomerate at a price based on its failing industrial assets, the Dior brand would come as part of the deal at a fraction of its true value. But while Arnault had the vision, he lacked the capital and the political connections to buy Boussac. So he turned to this guy, very interesting fellow called Antoine Bernheim. He was a senior partner at Lazard Frères. This is the elite Franco-American investment bank. And on a side note, William D. Cohn has a fantastic book on Lazard Frères called The Last Tycoons. I read it years ago. It's a brilliant read. Anyway, Bernheim was the kingmaker of French capitalism, someone who knew how to operate between big money and government power. So Arnault approached him with a very carefully staged plan. The first step was credibility. Arnault committed a relatively small amount of his own family capital, the equivalent of a few $1,000,000, and Bernheim, while initially sceptical, he was impressed with Arnault's vision and ambition. So Lazard Frères syndicated roughly $10 to $12 million in additional loans from outside investors. So this was structured as short-term financing to help recapitalise the Boussac holding company. The initial funding, it wasn't about control. It was about stabilising the group, reassuring the French state, and positioning Arnault as a serious white knight. And once the government was on side, the real deal followed. To take control of Boussac outright, Lazard assembled a much larger financing package. In total, the company was bought for around $60 million, with $15 million of that coming from Arnault. And the deal was signed in 1984. Now, as part of the deal, the government maintained that Arnault promised to preserve jobs, presenting himself as this industrial saviour. However, Arnault disputes this, and he insists the only pledge he made was to make the company profitable. As soon as the ink dried on the deal, and taking lessons he'd learned from John Kluge, the corporate raiders and the LBOs from the US, Arnault initiated a brutal restructuring plan designed to strip the group of its dead weight. Over the next 2 years, he laid off approximately 9,000 workers and began selling off the industrial textile assets. The French press, of course, they were horrified by what they saw as a breach of the social contract, and they briefly dubbed Arnault the Terminator. that nickname didn't stick. The nickname that has endured for Arnault over the decades is the Wolf in Cashmere. Unions protested, the government felt duped, but Arnault's legal control was absolute. The liquidation of Busac's asset raised roughly 500 million, and Arnault invested some of that back into the Dior brand, and the renamed holding company, which is called Financière Agache, began showing profits. From massive losses in 1984, the company was on track to post earnings of over 112 million on 1.9 billion of revenue by 1987. Most of this coming from the revamped Dior, validating Arnault's thesis that the brand was the only asset that mattered. And Arnault was now sitting on a mountain of cash, ready for his next targets. First, he bankrolled the creation of Christian Lacroix, the fashion house. Then he moved to reunite the fractured Dior empire. This all gets pretty complex, so I'll try to keep it simple. You see, while Arnault owned the couture house, the Dior perfume business, which was extremely lucrative, was actually owned by Moet Hennessy, the drinks company, because Busac sold it to Moet in 1968 to raise cash and shore up his struggling textile empire. And while Arnault was busy selling off Busac's various assets and getting Dior Couture back into shape, Moet Hennessy and Louis Vuitton merged to create LVMH in 1987. The reason behind the merger was defensive. The corporate raiding culture had crossed the Atlantic, and standalone luxury companies were seen as vulnerable targets, whereas by merging, they believed that they were too big for anyone to consider a hostile takeover. But the merger of Louis Vuitton and Moet Hennessy united two men who were total opposites in terms of temperament and strategy. So on the one side, you had Alain Chevalier. He ran Moet. He was a classic French technocrat and manager focused on industrial efficiency and wholesale distribution. Now, Henri Recamier, he ran Louis Vuitton. He was a 75-year-old successful steel industrialist who had taken over Louis Vuitton in 1977 when it was this quite traditional luggage maker with just 2 stores and $14 million in revenue. And by 1987, he had transformed it into this billion-dollar retail giant by cutting out wholesalers and opening 135 company-owned boutiques worldwide. Now, at this stage, it's important to point out that Louis Vuitton was still essentially a luxury luggage and leather goods company. Now, the merger was structured as a loose alliance rather than a unified corporation. They maintained separate headquarters and management teams, and because of this, there was no meeting of minds, no shared culture, no shared ambition, and friction, of course, was inevitable. Moet Hennessy operated on long, inventory-heavy production cycles and sold through third-party distributors. Louis Vuitton was fast-paced, retail-orientated, and vertically integrated. There was also financial disparity. Louis Vuitton was growing significantly faster and had much higher margins, and Recamier, the boss of Louis Vuitton, felt that his side was subsidising the capital-intensive spirits business. Also, Recamier, despite being vice-chairman to Chevalier's chairman, he believed he was the superior operator. He viewed Chevalier as a bureaucrat and himself as a true entrepreneur. And this personal hostility created a fracture in the company's governance, one Bernard Arnault would soon exploit. Now, the catalyst for Arnault's entry into LVMH was Black Monday. October 1987, LVMH shares plummeted, exposing the company to the very hostile takeovers it was designed to avoid. So in the wake of the crash, Recamier became paranoid, and fueling this paranoia was the partnership that Chevalier had built with Guinness. The companies were already allies. They had agreed to distribute their products jointly in North America and Asia, and Guinness had a 3.5% stake in LVMH. But Chevalier wanted to let Guinness increase this to 20% to protect against hostile takeovers. But Recamier, of course, saw this as a threat that the drink side would take control, and so he started looking for allies to help him oust Chevalier and seize full control. And of course, he looked to Bernard Arnault because there was a natural logic. Arnault controlled Dior Couture, while LVMH had the perfume business, and Arnault wanted that business. Recamier had also mistakenly thought that he had the measure of Arnault, that Arnault would simply be a junior partner. Now, before accepting Recamier's offer to invest in LVMH as his ally, Arnault consulted Antoine Bernheim, the Lazard Frere kingmaker who had helped him buy Boussac and who also sat on the board of LVMH. And from that vantage point, Bernheim could see the dysfunction between Recamier and Chevalier up close, and his advice to Arnault was simple. Don't side with either man. Instead, form an alliance with Guinness. So Arnault and Guinness then formed a joint venture through a holding company called Jacques Robert, and they acquired 24% of LVMH for around 1.6 billion. Guinness put up most of the money, but Arnault designed the strategy and the deal structure, and that's how he ended up with 60% of the holding company and control of the votes. Now, by this stage, of course, Recamier realised that Arnault wasn't going to be the supportive junior partner he had hoped for, and it forced him to cosy back up with Chevalier temporarily. They proposed breaking up LVMH, separating the wine and spirits from Louis Vuitton with the aim of diluting Arnault's influence. Arnault launched a public attack, arguing that a breakup would destroy shareholder value. Recamier then attempted a poison pill defence. He sought to issue warrants to friendly third parties, and these warrants, if exercised, would flood the market with new shares, diluting Arnault's stake. The big threat for Recamier was that Arnault was edging close to having 33% of the company, and in France, at that time, holding 33% constituted a blocking minority. In other words, it allows the shareholder with 33% to veto extraordinary resolutions such as capital increases or changes to the board. Now, Arnault's response to the poison pill was a masterstroke in aggression. In just 3 days, he spent $600 million, funded partly by the Boussac divestments and credit lines, to buy an additional 13.5% of LVMH stock, giving him 37.5%, becoming the dominant shareholder. And as the share price continued to rise, he spent another $500 million to bring his stake to 43.5%. So, with his dominant shareholding secured, Arnault pushed for a leadership overhaul. Alain Chevier was the first to go. Arnault replaced him as chairman. Now, Recamier was protected by board rights and political allies, so he couldn't be removed as easily, but instead he was sidelined. And he responded by launching a barrage of lawsuits, accusing Arnault of insider trading and market manipulation. And the French press loved it, and they called it the young wolf versus the old lion. But, crucially, the courts sided with Arnault. And in April 1990, Recamier resigned, leaving Arnault as the undisputed boss of LVMH at just 40 years old. So this was a huge business story, not just in France, but worldwide. And it's interesting to note how Arnault was viewed. In France, where showing open ambition was often frowned upon, Arnault's aggressive US-style approach created resentment. Many people disliked that he had taken control of what they saw as an established institution through aggressive means. At the same time, he also inspired a kind of, reluctant admiration. Now, the US press was far more supportive and intrigued because they saw in Arnault a rare case, a French businessman comfortable with US-style corporate combat. And despite all of this boardroom chaos, the LVMH business itself was performing extremely well. So a lot of kudos especially has to go to Recamier here. He was a fantastic businessman. In 1988, LVMH generated about 2.1 billion in revenue and earned roughly 170 million in profit. At a shareholder meeting in 1989, while this battle was going on, Arnault publicly predicted that profits would rise by at least 30% that year, and he delivered on that promise, strengthening his claim to lead the group. Away from the boardroom, there was a quieter drama happening in Arnault's personal life. He separated from his first wife in 1990, met the concert pianist Hélène Mercier and married her in 1991. And people say that the relationship softened his public image and tied him more closely to the world of art and culture. Now, inside LVMH, Arnault quickly swept aside the old guard and he hired Yves Carcel, who spearheaded Louis Vuitton's global expansion, especially in Asia, and began the long transition from a luggage specialist into a broader luxury fashion brand. And this expansion drove cash flow. Its revenues by 1995 were $6 billion, 3 times what it was before he took over. And with the foundation secure, Arnault finally had the room to take risks and turn his attention to creativity. Because this is the thing about Arnault. Right at the start, I mentioned his duality. On the one side, a brilliant, ruthless financier, and on the other, a trained pianist who inherited from his mother a deep appreciation for the arts. And up to now in the story, we haven't seen this side. But this is where it starts to show, because taste and artistic judgment play a central role in how Arnault built his empire. For example, and I love this anecdote, when interviewing senior executives at LVMH, Arnault brought candidates into a room filled with 100 neckties. Some were Dior, some were from competitors, some, in Arnault's view, were simply really bad, and he asked them to choose 10. And here's a quote from Arnault in relation to the screening process. He says, "It's very interesting. Some choose 10 ties that are really the worst. If they do that, then we move on to scarves. If they are bad with the scarves, well, then they really are in a difficult position." Now, on a more macro level, he implemented the star brand strategy. This is his belief that a luxury brand must be timeless yet modern, fast growing yet exclusive. I mean, a really hard balancing act. And to achieve this paradox, he centralized financial discipline while decentralizing creative chaos. And this term, creative chaos, it literally applies to some of the biggest decisions he would make when it came to who would be the leading designers in LVMH, because he understood better than anyone else that all brands needed shock and energy. Arnault's brand strategy, it also posited the theory that relevance is more valuable than tradition. And with this in mind, he took these huge gambles to prove the theory. First of all, in 1995, he appointed John Galliano as creative director of Givenchy. LVMH had bought Givenchy in 1988. Galliano was brilliant but divisive, and his theatrical shows brought instant attention. A year later, Arnault promoted Galliano to Christian Dior and brought in Alexander McQueen to Givenchy. And McQueen was just 27 years old. He was dubbed in the press as the hooligan of fashion, and his appointment was deliberately provocative, and the message was clear. LVMH would back bold, uncompromising talent. And finally, in 1997, Arnault made, I suppose, one of his most important creative bets. He hired the American designer Marc Jacobs as creative director of Louis Vuitton. Now, Jacobs had been fired from the American label Perry Ellis after his controversial 1993 grunge collection. It was critically divisive, failed to connect with the public, even though fashion historians now see it as being hugely influential, but it was a massive flop. But at Louis Vuitton, Jacobs launched the brand's first ready-to-wear line, completing Vuitton's evolution from a luggage specialist into a true fashion house. As Anna Wintour, who back then, as editor of Vogue, was the most influential voice in the fashion world, said of Arnault, "He is backing designers from everywhere, and God knows he is a force to be reckoned with. He has taken the most incredible risks in the designers he hired for what were very conservative houses, and he has brilliantly understood the power of their magnetism with the press." So piece by piece, Arnault was turning his taxi cab epiphany into a luxury empire. And as well as breathing fresh creativity into his luxury brands, he also moved to control distribution. In 1996, LVMH acquired a majority stake in duty-free shoppers for $2.47 billion. This was the world's largest chain of duty-free shops with over 180 stores worldwide. The deal was fiercely opposed by minority shareholder and billionaire Robert Miller, leading to another legal battle, which Arnault won again. In 1997, LVMH acquired Sephora to dominate the retail cosmetics market, giving the group control over the environment in which its perfumes were sold. So, in just 13 years, between 1984 and 1997, Arnault built an empire that was by now generating $8.2 billion in revenue. And he did it by taking control of companies others were unwilling to give up, using financial discipline, deal-making skill, and real toughness, and then applying creativity to revive and expand them. That combination of skills is so rare. You don't see it in many people. And the ability to increase everything about these brands, their revenue, their presence, while also not just keeping them exclusive, making them even more exclusive. It's a very fine balancing act. Now, that's the only judgment I'll make on Arnault for now. This is where we leave him for now. I'm not going to offer a final verdict yet because there's so much more to come. The next chapter, which I'll probably do next year, takes us into two major boardroom battles that Arnault has. One with Guinness and another with Gucci. And that story is going to be an absolute cracker. So that brings us to listeners' emails. And this one is from Joel or Joelle, who would love to hear an episode on Sean Parker, the guy behind Napster, and who I've mentioned before in episodes where Facebook has come up. And Joel, this is a cracking suggestion, and I'm so in the mood to research Sean Parker that I'm actually going to do him for the next episode. So thanks for the suggestion, Joel, and thanks for listening. And remember, if you have any comments, any corrections, or any story that you'd like me to cover, email me at info@gbspod.com. All the best, folks.